Let's talk about Dune Part 2. Alan and I were one of the many attendees who earlier this week went to see Dune Part 1. It's re-released in IMAX in theaters. And at the very end of the screening, very end, we saw Denis Villeneuve. He introduced a preview, an extended preview of Dune Part 2. The scene that we saw was Paul Atreides riding Shai-Hulud, which is, of course, one of the sandworms of Arrakis. And, of course, he called a big one, according to Stilgar. On IMAX screens, so just a couple quick thoughts on Dune Part 1. I have not seen it in a theater since it was originally released 2 years, more than 2 years? More than 2 years ago.
Yeah, it was just out of the dark times.
Yeah, it was fall of 2021 when Dune Part 1 was released in theaters. And seeing it again on the big screen, what was interesting because I've seen it on my 4K Blu-ray several times and on HBO Max, like a lot of other people, but seeing it on IMAX it was like I was seeing it again for the first time. Couldn't believe how good the movie looked. It was epic in scale. And I feel like Dune Part 1 was a couple things. One, it was a lot of world building. A lot of we're explaining how things work.
It was all world building.
It's all world building. And then one big thing that happens in the third act, which is the fall of House Atreides. Spoilers. There will be spoilers for Dune Part 1. But yeah, the fall of House Atreides, but the world building is so excellently done. And I think well translated from the book. I like the Bene Gesserit hand signals. I like the fact that Paul Atreides knows several different languages. He speaks a language with Dr. Yui. There's so many great things about it. There's a lot of setups that I expect to pay off in Dune Part 2. For example, Paul's relationship, Paul's experience with the Gom Jabbar. I feel like that will be reversed in Dune Part 2. And it was just great to see. I really wish what I could see is Dune Part 1 and Part 2 in one day. Just see that as a 6-hour thing. Some version of Barbenheimer. We can watch them both, but it was great. Any thoughts on Dune Part 1, seeing it in theaters again?
Yeah, so I will say that I enjoyed it the first time. I really enjoyed it in IMAX, and I had the pleasure of seeing it in the third row of my IMAX theater. And I will say it felt like that Denis had made the movie for IMAX, because there are some incredible shots that really there's a part where he's kind of following them over the dune to look at the decimation of the city that they had established, and the reveal of it just really worked in IMAX. I'll also say the sound in IMAX, incredible. When we get to the worm part, the sound is a big part of that. I also took my daughter because I just want to get her perspective, especially when when people say that science fiction isn't for girls, and I will say science fiction isn't for girls.
What, did she like it? What did she think?
She was like, she was not into it. She was
not even with Timothée Chalamet. He's like,
the reason I got her to go was Timothée Chalamet, and I think the problem that she had.
You are going to a desert planet. Planet Dune.
Sorry about that. Sorry, okay. Nothing.
The problem that she had with the movie, and I think we hinted upon it, was all set up. It was absolutely all set up. It was just, I go, this movie is for context, and context for Dune 2. And, quite frankly, she's new to the series, knew nothing about it. I told her, all she knows is that you're a big fan of it. And, I don't think, it's kind of like, I think the movie's more for fans than it is for the general public, because, it's like, all right, the way I described it was Dune 1 is setting up the chessboard. And I think, and now Dune 2 will be the first moves. And so, so if you're coming in uninitiated, I think you're just going to get that sense of this is setting up the chessboard.
Yeah, it really is the setup for all the events of Dune Part 2, which are Dune Part 2 is the payoff.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it was smart to call it part 1 because it's very much a part 1.
It very much is a part 1. But so after you see Dune Part 1, which I just noticed details like I noticed that you see Aaliyah in a vision from Paul. So we actually have seen Aaliyah. She's literally just a baby, right? Just a kid. I mean, probably 6 months old or less. So we actually have seen Aaliyah, technically speaking, but not Aaliyah as she will be portrayed in Dune Part 2. Now, the preview is introduced by Denis, the director, and we see this scene. It is epic in scale. You've got, and it actually kind of, and what's interesting, it is kind of explains like to conquer the worm, so to speak, is you've got to actually have these hooks, right? These maker hooks, whatever that Paul throws out, and you got to kind of pull up the scales so that it twists the worm so you're on top, right? You're not on the side, and then you can ride the worm. We see this scene play out. It's a big, yes, I know, don't take that out of context. You see Paul Atreides riding the worm. It's epic. It's an incredible scene. The sound, especially in IMAX, with just the theater shook. And by the way, I don't know if you knew this, Alan, but during that screening, there was an earthquake.
No.
There was an earthquake, and we didn't feel it. I feel like nobody felt it. We were all
maybe it caused it.
Did you feel the earthquake? I didn't feel it. So none of us actually felt the earthquake, but it was really amazing. So,
yeah.
So I don't know what. Look, I'll just say this: to describe it is to do it a disservice. It must be seen in IMAX. This movie was made for IMAX. And Denis Villeneuve, in his introduction, he says, and here's to cinema. He doesn't say, he does this little praise to cinema. I feel like there are certain filmmakers out there. Christopher Nolan is one of them. By the way, Tenet is being re-released in theaters in a couple of weeks.
Because people want that.
For IMAX. Look, I didn't love Tenet. I've seen it in IMAX already. But I'll probably go back and see it. But it's, there are some filmmakers committed to like, hey, let's make real cinema because people will come out for it. Okay. So there you go. I thought the scene was fantastic. And then there's a montage of scenes. Many of them we've already seen. So I'm going to be honest. I was a little disappointed because I went to a preview of Dune Part 1. They showed the first 10 minutes of the movie. Then they showed like an extended look, an extended trailer. And then they showed some behind the scenes and making of. It was about 30 minutes long. For Dune Part 1, that's what they did. For Dune Part 2, it was literally like maybe a 10 or 12 minute thing. Not as a little disappointed that they didn't show more.
Yeah, you wanted them to show the movie after that.
Well, it was interesting that we saw the first 10 minutes of Dune Part 1. It was so different than anything we've seen.
Yeah, but he showed you the most iconic moment of the series, of the two movies.
Right.
I mean, that has to say something. Also, yeah, like again, I'll go to the sound. Sound was incredible during that entire scene. Your seats are shaking like crazy as it's going on. And also, he talks a little bit about, I think he wanted to really up the game of that scene, and I believe he did it in terms of getting the weight, the size of what was going on, and then the difficulty of doing the task. Or as you like to see, say, Timothée Chalamet riding the worm.
And we're gonna see
that.
What I do love is that he describes it as a war movie. It's literally a war movie with the Fremen led by Paul Atreides, basically shutting down spice production on Arrakis in a way to wield power. It's very much like an allegory for the Middle East and oil. It's also, Dune is inspired by, especially with the character of Stilgar, who's channeling Anthony Quinn from Lawrence of Arabia. So it's inspired. These are the sources of inspiration. And then, of course, I mean, and people forget, the original Dune, the first novel, it was serialized in science fiction pulp magazines. Then it was published in 1965. 12 years later, George Lucas comes out with Star Wars. And Frank Herbert at the time was upset because there was a lot of influence from in Star Wars, the movie, the first movie, not A New Hope, Episode 4, none of that. the first Star Wars movie released to theaters was very inspired by aspects of Dune. So, you know, it's just nice. It's nice to see a nearly faithful adaptation of Dune on the big screen. I'll say this though, I still think Dune as a miniseries, done on a Game of Thrones level in epic scale, would be really fun to do someday. I would love to see HBO because look, if you look at George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones, it's Dune. It's great houses. They're fighting over dominance, the Iron Throne, and the Dune world is very much like that. So, and there's sex in both of those things. So
there you go. Now you
make of that what you will.
Yes,
but
there you go. Now make the series. I'm in now.
I couldn't be more excited. But Dune Part 2, there is a fan screening on Sunday, February 25th, 7 p.m. I've got tickets. I'll be there. Hopefully Alan and I will get to see it earlier so we can tell you about it. But I will be there on the 25th. Yeah. Let's check out your comments.
The way it's been working is, hey, Alan, we're going to invite you to a screening. Can I bring Chris? Let me get back to you on that one.
Oh, I'm just going to crash it. I don't care. I'm going to act stupid. This is sometimes my move, not to out myself. What I do sometimes is I act like I don't know what I'm doing and I'm stupid. I know exactly what I'm doing. So you've been warned.